Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So last week we didn't have our econ show, so we're back with our normal edition of what we find interesting and some of the important points going forward. You know, in the first segment, we're going to talk about geopolitical risk as growing. And it's not a crazy assumption. You know, we've talked about it since last year, but we want to look at why is it growing, where are there issues, and what do we think is going to happen over the next, few months for the most part. Then we're going to look at some of the inflation drivers that happened in January. Remember, we thought that the rate of change in inflation was going to slow in January. It did not. It actually went much higher. So we want to look at what's happening there, and is there going to be more to come? Then we're going to look at consumer pressure. And I know retail sales beat, but we also want to look at, did they actually beat? Like, what is the volume versus the value, and where are retail sales going, and what is the retail consumer facing as we go through the remainder of really 2022? Then we're going to look at Europe inflation and the pressure on real wages as that continues to grow. And then we want to look at China activity and their new GDP target of about 5%, 5.5%. And is that something that is doable? And really, why do they keep kind of creating these targets? After covering that, we want to go directly into, what are we looking at, and some of the key pieces for the geopolitical risk. So as anybody who's been following us knows, we've been saying since really the end of 2019 into 2020, that the geopolitical risk was only going to get worse. And we essentially wrote an article talking about how post-COVID, this is what we expect. And it's just coming to light across the board. There's, pretty much every continent at this point has some sort of either civil war or something happening in terms of conflict, with obviously the biggest one that's stealing the headlines being Ukraine and Russia, which we'll talk about in a minute. So just to give you an idea of how these things are going to continue to mount, and even if when Russia and Ukraine back off and you see some tension slowing down there's other flashpoints that we've been highlighting and talking about that is going to keep things fairly, for lack of a better term, interesting over the next several years. So I think one of the bigger and important pieces of why does this matter when we look at Ukraine and Russia, and you can see the amount of pipelines that traverse Ukraine, and just in terms of just some other ones, like there's obviously a whole network of pipelines, but this gives you an idea of Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, and where other gas goes through. And you can see how pivotal the Ukraine is in terms of moving some of this capacity into Western Europe. So there's a lot of reasons why that if Russia were to move in, they would have to make sure they can take control, because at the same time, the Ukrainians aren't exactly huge fans of Russia, and they'd be very quick to destroy, not so much the pipelines, just because there's a lot of risk in that, but you could take out a pump station, you could take out the electrical power to it. There's a lot of things that could be done to make life very difficult for a Russian occupation, especially from an economic level, as well as some of the other pieces. Now, when we look at where forces are on the Eastern Europe, here you can see that there in this Luhansk area right over here, there was, which is the rebel-controlled area versus where the Ukraine army controls, and there was mortar fire and things happening overnight in that region. So we're already starting to see some pushback. Russia has claimed that they are moving positions out of Belarus and back into Russia after the war games or exercises expired and ended. And then we're seeing conflicting reports that they actually haven't moved anything, but they've actually increased it. We're seeing some additional capacity to build bridges. So there's pontoon boats that can essentially be used to deploy some of these things very quickly. And we're seeing that moving to the front line. So again, this conflicting data points, but we still hold to the fact that no one really wants a big conflict here. And not to say that anybody ever wants a big conflict when it comes to war, but there's a lot to be gained in terms of showing force but not carrying through. And now with that being said, there is obviously, as you can see here, a lot of personnel and equipment on those borders. And it's very difficult to have that much equipment without some sort of flashpoint. And so we do think there's going to be a flashpoint. There is going to be, a battle, depending on how big or small that may be, is going to vary. But I think that is going to be that flashpoint where that is the point of the pinnacle of where this goes. And then it's a de-escalation from that point as people get together to figure out how do we make this work, and concessions will be given on both sides. But one of the things that becomes a bigger problem and some of the issues when you think about Russia is what comes out of Russia. What does an energy embargo look like? And it's not just going to be on just oil, because it'll be on gas and it'll be on other things, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But this gives you an idea of how vulnerable are people to an energy embargo, and you can see how the knock-on effects really go throughout all of from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. And when you look at prices and you look at inflation and you look at the pressures on those economies, any type of embargo would only make this worse. And this is looking at it from the natural gas perspective, the loss of euros, the increase in price. I mean, dated Brent went over $100 for a reason, because refiners are avoiding the purchase of euros to find other barrels in order to produce the products that we need for daily life. Now, when you look at the top sources of European natural gas imports, you can get an idea of just how much comes from Russia. And this is why when we look at the pressure points, when we look at the problems in general, here's where you're getting an idea of the amount of capacity that has to go and has to be replaced. And do we have the capacity to replace it? And the short answer is really no. And you can see the consistency. So this is also when you factor out seasonality, because obviously you're going to burn more gas in January than you will in April. And there's some of those impacts, but Russia's always been the base capacity. And then you have Norway, Algeria, and the US has been more of the swing. But how are you going to replace so much of the Russian volumes? And is there enough really on the water to do so without causing some significant issues? And the short answer is no. So when you look at also other things outside of Russia, palladium, when you think about the manufacturing of cars and cleaning out the exhaust, there's a lot of these other pieces that come out of Russia outside of just gas and oil. Palladium, platinum, iron ore, wheat. A lot of these pieces that are necessary for the construction of goods and assets as well as food is going to become a much bigger focal point, because we already have tightness in some of these other markets that will only make the prices go higher and increase the inflationary pressures and spirals elsewhere. And then when you look at the minerals used, so we've talked about Russia, some of the impacts that would happen. Obviously, it goes both ways. We would take away their ability to transact in US dollars. They would have a huge economic impact, because we wouldn't buy these products and they need it for their own economy. So again, it's not just a one-sided hit, but it's just we would experience pain on multiple levels. But when we look at minerals and it leads us into, well, where are we going to get some of this stuff? And this is, if you take away some of the geopolitical risk, where does it come from? You look at electric vehicles in terms of the amount of copper, nickel that goes into it versus a conventional car. Power generation, the amount that goes into offshore wind, onshore wind, solar. There's a lot of these pieces that need to be sourced. And how are they going to be sourced in a meaningful way that is renewable when you think about cradle to grave and what is the true ESG score? So when you look at the materials that go into some of these the key pieces, you can see how difficult it is or how onerous it is on the supply chain to make wind power, solar panel, EVs. And I'm not saying that it isn't the same to make other products like an ICE vehicle or natural gas fired capacity, but it just gives you an idea that it's not, it still has its own problem, and it still has its own supply chain and its own, peccadillos when you're looking at what makes it tick and what really is the ESG score on that, on going from the beginning to the very end of the cycle. And I think this is something that needs to be fleshed out to understand are we really going from a solution to a bigger problem or just a different problem? And that's where we keep coming back to the importance of a basket approach. And yes, wind power may make sense in some areas, same with solar, but The same could be said for coal and natural gas, especially with the growing adoption and the advancements that we've seen across carbon capture, flue gas capture, and what we can do with some of those products. So again, there's something to be said and a conversation to be had around what is the right basket approach and how do we go about this going forward. Especially when we look at China and the Chinese dominance in the clean energy materials. So people like to look at ESG and talk about just the E, but there's also the social and the governance side. What is the social impact of Chinese entity? What are they doing to the local populace? What are their human rights issues and violations? What about governance? Do they have the government insiders? Are they taking IP and being disseminated locally to create an unfair working advantage? There's a lot of pieces that come into that to be true ESG, and I think there's that overarching focus on the E when we almost forget that there's another two letters in the acronym. And I think when you look at rare earths, when you look at the Chinese consumption of and production of copper, nickel, and again where they're processed. And it's dirty to process these things. So do we trust China to do them in the best environmental way possible? Are we seeing the best shifts? And that's why when we look at going forward, it's not only just what control do they have over our supply chain? Are we going to get to a point now after diversifying some other supply chains that we're now going to go right back to the belly of the beast and rely on them even more for that clean energy metals and the production and manufacturing? Now, China's also used that to their advantage to go into Africa and have that what's called the Chinese-African trade takeover. So we've talked about it before on multiple occasions. I've actually given several talks on this recently. When you look at the amount that has been invested from China into the African nations, and the problem is it is more along the lines of debt colonialism than it is make partnerships and creating value. And that's why there has been a bigger push to diversify away from Chinese exposure, find other partners to increase their appetite with in order to avoid some of these underlying problems, which we continue to see as China takes more ownership and assets as collateral based on unpaid debt and unpaid costs and fees, which again creates more underlying problems. But when you look at what is happening, and I was asked today, what do I think was happening in 2019, and did COVID kind of hide some of the issues? And I go back to my view. If you look at where things were in 2019, coming out of 2018, because remember China stopped easing and they started to tighten up a bit at the end of 2018. And you can see 2019 had a very slow period. And you saw this gradual move lower. Output prices were coming down. Output in general was falling. We saw some of this slowdown that accelerated really in July, August of 19. But then look at that massive surge. And that's just based on what we've seen in terms of a massive response on the fiscal side, the monetary side. But now look at where prices are. So we fixed a problem, but what did we do with it? Because now you have output coming down, but prices staying high, and that's becoming this underlying problem when you look at central bank activity and what comes next on the monetary policy side. And that's when you start looking at output and future output. Future output starting to get a bit better as output has fallen, and that's because there's backlogs. You're starting to see some normalcy come back in. So it's not all negative, which is why when we talk about these things, it's not that it's going to go contraction yet. We do think that comes later on, but it's just this general slowdown into an expansion, but just a slower expansion than what I think is being discussed. And that's when you look at the global manufacturing PMI, how we're seeing this general trend from October into January and how things are coming back down. Now, there's a lot to be had within that. Supply chains are easing a bit, and again, that was a positive contribution, negative overall. But based on the way the numbers are calculated, that was actually a positive contribution, which we were saying, and we did a deep dive on how that really is kind of a misnomer. So as the supply chain gets a little bit better, this naturally comes down, but we continue to see some of these pressure points just as that demand on a global level continues to moderate, which we keep seeing on the world manufacturing surveys. And this is just looking at it from a different perspective. The world is contracting a bit. You see we're still elevated, and we just think this drifts much closer to that 52 level as we see some of this capacity come out and more pressure from, again, government tightening, as well as central banks starting to rein in inflation and raising rates. And when you look at the input prices, so even though we're having some of this moderation, we're seeing some of these things, you get an idea of how high input prices are around the world. This is a big problem because we import. The U.S. is the largest importer in the world. We take products from all of these, whether semi-finished or finished, and you get an idea of how we're going to continue to import this problem, which is why even though some things are getting a bit better, and we saw that with import prices surprise to the upside. So you're seeing some of these different pieces when you're looking at just where some of this inflation is, again, giving way to that stagflation versus an outright deflation. But when you look at the global economic growth, that's when we look at global oil consumption. You're seeing, again, as global price averages and just activity moderates, so does oil consumption. And that's why we continue to see this weight, if you will, keeping activity lower, keeping consumption down. And as prices continue to rise, that's, again, going to be another deterrent of spending and how we're going to see, again, a lot of this movement in terms of oil demand in the region. But as we continue to see going forward, again, coming back to raising rates, the value of global negative yielding debt is down by $10 trillion over the past year and is now at the lowest level since 2015. So when you're looking, again, at these fears around, what is happening on rates, what is happening with yield, you're starting to see some of these pressure points. And again, a lot of this different capacity, going from negative to positive in terms of what the nominal rates look like, which is just showing you some of the additional pressures because, again, that's the monetary drag that we're talking about as the cost of capital gets more expensive. It's still obviously dirt cheap versus historics, but once you get used to this price, this yield, that's when, or cost really, or weighted average cost of capital, that's when you see more problems develop. And then that leads into where are we on the food side? So global food prices are back on the rise. Though an annual change is easing, the level is testing a highs from over a decade ago. And this is, again, putting that pressure on emerging markets that is going to continue to be a problem and a driver coming full circle back to that geopolitical risk. And then when you look at just the BLS index of food prices, it has surged to an all-time high. And that's when you're just looking at, again, these pressure points because people will kill over food and water. And this is one of those bigger issues that we've been highlighting for what seems like a very long time at this point. And you get an idea that we're well above where we were in 2011 and now well above where we were in 2011 and that spike in 2014 as we get a lot of these reversals and pressure points. But on the supply chain side, we are seeing some of this ease. We are seeing some of the log jams. Obviously, when you zoom out, they're still there. And that's what we've been saying is that they're going to still exist. They just won't be as bad as they initially were. And those are some of the benefits that we're going to see, again, but at the same time, bringing down some of those PMI numbers to, I think, truer levels as some of the supply chain issues ease. But the cost savings on that is going to be passed on in terms of wages going higher. So then when you look at, peak goods inflation, there's some views that, you could see some peak inflation. China PPI, which is historically a leading indicator, that's come down a bit. We'll talk about that in a minute. So some of these things are starting, but what we think is going to happen is not so much this big drop down, but really kind of this sideways move as we see some of these pressure points and some of these mitigating factors keeping things elevated, especially on the sticky inflation front. So then when you look at household consumption, there's a view that household consumption is set to rise rapidly across developing countries as wealth increases. So as you can go by what we have been saying, we don't really think that there is going to be a big increase in wealth in the near term. I think this is going to hold true over the longer term, but when you look at the near-term impacts and problems, there's going to be a lot of pressure, especially when you think about the cost of food and the underlying cost of just general living wages. And that leads us to ship U.S. exports, and we exported a record of $177 billion of agriculture products in 2021, and we are so far off to another strong start, with a lot of it going into China, other areas. As the U.S., we talk about food prices, but food prices in the U.S., while they'll go higher, we still have enough food to feed ourselves, and we export excess. So the question is, as that excess dwindles, or the cost rises of that excess, what is that going to do, and what is the pressure that's going to put on the rest of the global market? And then when you look at USDA monthly Brazil soybean production, trying to figure out how unusual the recent reductions are for Brazil soybeans, USDA's 2022 harvest forecast has dropped 7% in 2 months. The only steeper cuts in the last 14 years came in 2012, when 75 metric tons in December became 66. The 2009 crop was negative 6.2 million tons from initial. So we're in an extreme period, and as weather hits, now we went from extreme heat to, I don't know if anyone saw the flash floods that was creating mudslides. Neither one of those are good for crops and obviously human life, but just in general, what is happening on feeding their people and then exporting the excess, which is going to keep that pressure on the underlying market. And then it's not any better in Argentina, where the USDA's forecast for Argentina's soybeans have unfolded by the month. The 2022 harvest forecast is down 13% from the initial versus negative 10% last year and 5% in the same period in 2018. So again, you're starting to see these pressure points that are continuing to rise and be a problem, which is something that we think is going to be an overarching theme as we progress through 2022. And again, that sticky inflation and cost of living. So then when you look at the total USDA WASDE, world wheat stocks came in slightly below expectations as use was increased in places like Canada and India. Corn and soybeans land a little higher than trade guesses, but are lower than last month. And China's soy imports were cut 3 million tons to 97 million, now below last year. So again, kind of in line, but you're getting an idea that in line is still not what we need. We need surplus, we need a bumper crop, and we're just not getting that, especially on a world level as pressure remains. On the U.S. side, ending stocks for U.S. soybeans came down 25 million bushels on an increase in crush. Exports were unchanged, corn unchanged as demand items were kept as is, and wheat stocks landed higher. So again, even with something fairly in line, we still got a big price movement, and the pressure continues to grow. So as we look at just in that backdrop and kind of carry that in your mind's eye as we go forward through the next few segments and look at just how this is not only going to impact emerging markets, but the U.S. in general, and why we continue to see some of this stress on just wealth growth, wealth creation, and just what the general market is going to look like when we go through the economic growth.